I believe I am live right now. So there are a few things that I am going to try to do. At the beginning, let me just remind you all that my limited and finite attention will be garnered and gained more easily through super chats and super stickers, which support the program. You can also support at patreon.com/oxum or directly here on YouTube by $5 donation or $1 donation a month. And with a multiplication factor, it's obviously going to be great. So, what I'm going to start off with is, well, briefly, I can say before I get into the meat of it, that I've been streaming a lot, predominantly with StreamYard, getting off of a 10-week course. Just was it, I don't even know what day of the week it is anymore because I'm on break. um, Yesterday I just completed the final class of a 10-week course. I was teaching 4 hours a week Amharic, so you saw a slowdown in my production capacities, but now I'm on break and I'm done with that course, so I'm trying to give you all more and more content. So anyway, this is an example of me experimenting. I always like playing and tinkering with the various technologies that I'm doing. You could say it's something to do with my high trait openness, or you can say that the big five personalities are BS if you're more in the Telebian camp. Anyway, I'm testing the difference between StreamYard and YouTube in terms of live. I did that at the protest on Sunday as well. I lived straight from my phone on the YouTube app, and now I'm on YouTube via one of my computers. So the meat of it is Jack Murphy. If you know him, he's a kind of center right podcaster. He says, "Is there such a thing as a based translation of the Bible?" So I answered him, the obvious answer that would be given by, really the only answer that would be given by my greatest teacher in scripture. I've had many teachers in scripture, and I can give them all sorts of shout outs in the Ethiopian church community, the Ethiopian Orthodox community, but also in the Greek communion, and even people outside of that communion. Um, I can give those shout outs in a bit, but my greatest teacher is without a doubt Father Paul Nadim Tarazi, and he grew up in the Greek rite, or in the Greek communion of Palestine. And there's a lot to be said, and I've written about the Palestinian rite before, as I've been told by one of his greatest students, Father Mark Boulos, both of whom I work with in the Ephesus School Network with the Tawahado Bible Study. That's been lagging a bit the past 3 months. You could say I've been lagging, but they've been producing all the time. It's incredible, their pace. It's hard to even keep up with them. But their answer, the answer of Father Mark Boulos and the answer of Father Paul Nadim Tarazi, would be that the biblical language is Hebrew and then later Greek, but the substrate of even the Greek is always the Hebrew. So you always have to try to get to the original Hebrew, and it's not a Masoretic Hebrew, it's whatever Hebrew that the Septuagint was translated from. So you have to read the Masoretic Hebrew, you have to read the Septuagint Greek, and then you have to read the New Testament Greek. You should probably also have some knowledge of Aramaic, and the Syriac is a great witness for one form of literary Aramaic. But these are the languages: Hebrew primarily, secondarily Greek, and third Aramaic. And that's for the Old Testament especially, but for the Old and the New, it'll also help you to study scripture in the other Semitic languages and to compare other pieces of literature from that time, like the good folks at Logos Bible Software do, and they're Protestants, but they do really great work. They have a Lexham English Septuagint that I use, and their translation of the Apostolic Fathers into English is great as well. But there's just no replacement for knowing the original languages of Scripture. That's the first answer. The second answer I have for him is I give three people: David Bentley Hart's translation of the New Testament, N.T. Wright's translation of the New Testament, and Robert Alter's translation of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. David Bentley Wright is an Orthodox Christian who has strayed from the path a little bit with his apocastasis, or that all should be saved theology, which he's not alone. There have been some people within church tradition who've gone that route, but putting that sort of ideology aside, his translation of the New Testament is absolutely beautiful, and it's his personal creative attempt to make the most literal translation in the prettiest English possible. So that's what his is all about. The second one I said was N.T. Wright, a retired bishop in the Anglican tradition in the Church of England, which is usually, it's hit or miss. Sometimes they're super orthodox, sometimes they're not. Great people like N.T. Wright, like C.S. Lewis, like Sebastian Brock, like, if I'm not mistaken, Ralph Lee, like Richard Pankhurst, have all been produced out of the Church of England. So there are just absolute giants who've come out of it. And N.T. Wright is maybe only rivaled by Sebastian Brock. Those two are the two greatest living witnesses of the Anglican tradition. And he goes the opposite direction. And him and David Bentley have argued a lot about this vociferously. And he goes for the thought for thought translation. So his translation of the New Testament is super thought for thought. Both of them are geniuses in the Greek. I am less than a beginner in the Greek. I'm a beginner in Hebrew. So maybe I could say a little bit more about the secular slash atheist Jew Robert Alter, who has a literary background, which I think aided him. And he probably grew up with Torah and Tanakh. And so he also has this translation of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And the thing about these three that makes them based is that they are fruits of the auteur theory in film critic circles, or in history circles, what's called the great man theory. And what that means is that these are not the works of a committee. The word committee is so tied to communism. The Ge'ez word for committee is derg, and it's so reviled in modern Amharic that people just outright avoid the word. So people don't even use the word derg. They'll just say the word committee with an accent, like komite, when they're speaking Amharic, because of how disgusted they are with that idea. And you can extend that to other fields like film and history that I did, and I'll go a little bit more into that. But basically, the opposite of a committee is an individual. And David Bentley Wright, N.T. Wright, and Robert Alter have all produced translations of Scripture, the first two, the New Testament, and the latter on the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, as individuals. And that's what makes them based, because they have total creative control. They have the final say. They are the deciders. They are the judge. And what's great about that system, I believe in the system in basketball as well. Um, I'm forgetting his name now, but there was a great coach when I was watching college basketball a lot more around 2008, for UCLA. I might as well search engine it up here with what I got. Let's see, UCLA basketball coach 2008. Who was it back then? What was his name? Ben Howland. Thank God for search engines. So Ben Howland had this huge emphasis on different batches of teams. So he would have them play man defense rather than zone. And the reason is because the zone might be more effective in any particular case, but it's harder to recognize where the weak points are, where the chinks in the armor are. So with man defense, you know exactly who's at fault and who's doing great. And so it's an individual analysis that goes on, and he'll usually have like two batches of teams that he puts in back to back. So you see this in another field of sports, and specifically collegiate basketball, which is a little bit more fast paced than the NBA because they're slightly less cream of the crop. And so they'll be a little bit less athletic and will have to rely on their basketball IQ or EQ a little bit more. So this total creative control, this final decision making, this judgment is what makes everything kind of different. Thomas Carlyle, whom I learned about via Moldbug, but I kind of knew some of the things that he was famous for without knowing the attribution to him. And it's crazy we don't learn about him in school, but then it kind of does make sense. So he has this text, which I have to read, which I haven't yet, although I have read all but a few pages of the Moldbug Reader on Carlyle. So I've seen great portions of some things. He has this book called On Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic in History. And this is kind of the spring from which the great man theory springs, and then later the Nietzschean idea of the Übermensch, which is, I think, a hyped up version of the Yiddish. Just hey, this guy's a mensch or a man, right? Yiddish being a dialect of German, spoken by some Near Eastern folks, genetically not too distant from moi. Renee Groot says, "እንደምንዋልክ ደህና እግዚአብሔር ይመስገን." አማርኛ ተናጋሪ ነው, or did you just plug that into Google Translate? It's pretty good. I had an old boss who had Google Translate headphones, and I had to speak slower, but I spoke Amharic to her, and it live translated through her headphones. I think it was connected to her phone. I don't know if it was an individual device, and it was pretty impressive. So anyway, I have to read On Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic in History to get a bigger idea of what the great man view of history is. But basically, you have Thomas Carlyle and then later James Froude, who write in this tradition. Especially, Froude is written on so many topics like Roman history and English history. I listened to a podcast called The Fall of Rome, which takes the exact opposite take by historian Patrick Wyman. I also had the great Dr. Benjamin Studebaker on my program, who also takes this other approach, the more left approach. And both Patrick Wyman and Benjamin Studebaker take the approach that what is going on more than individuals acting are systems and factors, and placing an emphasis on that. Where I actually find myself is always kind of in the center of these things and seeing how these contradictory ideas, or these ideas that are in tension with one another, through that tension get to the larger truth. And I think Dan Carlin does a great example of that. He has kind of like a third theory of history, and I don't remember what it is at the time, but those are the two big ones. The kind of major left wing and the kind of major right wing theories, the theory of individuals and the theory of systems. And what he does is he takes both sides. He doesn't just take one. And so, you know, usually you need certain systems, certain factors in place for historical change to happen. But more often than not, it takes some courageous, unique individual to just run away with the show and make that thing happen. Like, I don't believe in automatic history. You know, something's got to give. Someone has got to do something at some time or some place. A lot of Ethiopians, Eritreans, Djiboutians, and Somali were protesting just a couple days ago, and they were showing their solidarity in, I think, 27 cities. I was at the Hollyweird protest and I live streamed it for a little bit, and you got to see them saying the kind of Trump lines that CNN is fake news, that the BBC is fake news, that Al Jazeera is fake news, that Reuters is fake news. And really a lot of the animosity was at CNN, which I think they felt betrayed them the most, because these are people who I grew up listening in a household where CNN and NPR were just, spitting facts for us all day long. And that's what I was exposed to probably the most in terms of news organizations. So people keep asking me for sources on Twitter. What I tell you is this: there is an inherent and implicit bias to the structure of what your source of news is. So there's a difference between organizations versus individuals, which is related to these Bible translations that I began talking about. So you just have to trust individuals. And I can't tell you who to trust, but I can give you a few examples. If you trust me and listen to me. Um, Hermela Aragawi is great because she's an ethnic Tigrayan, at least partially. I don't know to what extent. I mean, my seventh ancestor is Tigrayan too, so I don't know if I get to claim that. And in fact, part of the Tigrayan aristocracy, which always intermarried with the Amhara aristocracy. So anyway, Hermela Aragawi was on one side of the TPLF versus the United Forces of the Horn of Africa before, and now she switched. So she's an interesting person to follow, and you can check her out all over the place on YouTube, on Twitter. I mean, she's the one who started the hashtag no more. So check that out too, and you could see her. The Anglo writer Jeff Pierce is very interesting. He's written about Victorian age people. For those of you who appreciate Victorian England, he's also written about Ethiopia's victory in World War II. So he has some knowledge and has done some research, and he's been very active as an individual against all of these news organizations that have this agenda against Ethiopia. And his only agenda is being a fan of this place that he studied, researched, and wrote about. He doesn't have any sort of other agenda going on. Renee Groot says, Amarinya Achilalo. To be honest, most translators give funny output sometimes, but they are getting better. That's right. Alam, Salam, Heno, Kamelha, Zahawe. Habesha parents are getting red pilled by these events about media just now because of this war. That's very true, and I'm taking advantage of that. A lot of people actually asked me to speak on Sunday, and I said not yet. When the time is right, I will. Um, I learned from Jocko Willink that when you are more intentional about when you speak versus when you don't, people tend to listen to you more. I had a momentum pendulum shifts in my life where I was very quiet and diabetic. I stay at home a lot, had very few close friends. Uh, More nerd than Chad. But then, through speech and debate, forensics, through communication courses, through one of my first jobs out of college, which gave me a lot of leadership opportunities, and through my advancements in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, I got a lot of opportunities to talk. And then I became too much of a loudmouth. So now my pendulum is kind of swinging back and I'm more measured. And so, yes, I will be dishing out more red pills to the Habesha community, to the communities from the Horn of Africa as soon as I can. Alam, on the topic of scripture, could you make more videos on Tawahdo canon? Example, Enoch and Jubilees. Yeah, I need to read more Enoch and Jubilees. I've never sat down and read those texts from cover to cover. I'm named after Enoch, so I've seen Enoch or Enoch all over, Genesis and Hebrews and Jude. And I've read about 10 chapters in Amharic of the book of Enoch, but I wanted to improve my Ge'ez to the point where I could read the original, because the extants are only in that. Everything else is translated from that or from fragments. And my Ge'ez is about 60%. I'd like it to get to at least 80%. Otherwise, I have to keep going to my Mazgabak Alat or my dictionary every few seconds or every few pages. So when I do that, yeah, a more kind of thorough review of the biblical canon I could do, and maybe I would do that with Deacon Mahadi, who's studied that topic a little bit. Him and I have exchanged a lot of works on that, and him and I have some projects down the pipeline as well. Mufak Adasalasi says salam salam and damanesh dananesh way. So anyway, we're discussing biblical translations. What's the most based translation? And I think it's individuals. And then I related it to news organizations and the difference between CNN versus trusted individuals like me or Jeff Pierce or Hermela Aragawi, or you could say whoever else you trust in the ongoing kind of war news. um, I, I think I would also compare that to an organization like that considers itself the standard bearer, like the New York Times, in terms of plain news, and then cultural news, the New Yorker versus Substack. And we've seen a lot of editors recently on Twitter say that people who go to Substack are people who hate editors, and people who hate editors are bad. Well, that's a bad take. And it's usually not great men who are saying those things from these editor positions. You can have a great editor who is not trying to, um, change your creativity or your thrust, but you could also have people who just chip at you and chip at you and chip at you. And, as the old adage goes, one paper cut is not going to do a lot of damage, but a thousand paper cuts or a thousand little chipping away, mixing my metaphors here, it's going to take away from the quality of the product. It's inherently going to be a compromise of a compromise of a compromise, depending on how many different revisions there are. If we're not talking about grammar, uh, but style and then actual content, it gets pretty egregious. And I've worked with them before. I've been published in the Journal of the California Caucus of University and College Ombuds. It's one experience I've had, where I was, revising for like 6 months. The end product ended up good, but could have been different. Even for my own grandmother's newsletter, I had my aunt as editor before, and had negative experiences with that too. So the thing about Substack, where you find people like Curtis Yarvin, like Glenn Greenwald, like Razib Khan, and many others, Matt Iglesias, so many different people, Andrew Sullivan, I believe, what's her name? Weiss, who left the New York Times, is there. They're just thriving out there. They're absolutely thriving out there in the Substack world, getting the money kind of direct to consumer instead of mediated through this organization, which has this kind of particular political bias and ideological bias that seeps into everything to make everything sort of a mediocre quality, where sometimes maybe the writing in isolation is really beautiful still and is still the standard bearer, but it's missing the kind of flair, it's missing the spunk, it's missing the pizzazz that a project ran by an individual would have. So, talked about kind of the major network news organizations versus individuals, talking about these publications that are organizations versus individuals, and talking about that in biblical translations, committees versus individuals like N.T. Wright, David Bentley Hart, and Robert Alter, whose translations I encourage you to read in English. But of course, above that, I encourage you to learn the original languages of Scripture, which are Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and there is no substitute for that. So, I could also say, just a brief word, if you have to co-author something, I think there's an episode of the Tom Woods Show with Walter the Moderate Block, Dr. Walter the Moderate Block, and he talks about how he's co-authored. I mean, he's authored like over 500 papers, and I think a good like half of them are with his undergraduate students. And so there's a way in which you could collaborate with people. I told you I'm collaborating with Deacon Mahadi right now. There's a way in which you could collaborate with people, but you either both have an agreed upon vision, or there's one of you who's clearly in charge. One of you is a senior and one of you is a junior. One of you is going to make the final decision, and the other one is sort of assisting that vision. In the 20th century in Ethiopian history, you have the great scholar Desta Taklaweld is the junior to the great scholar Kidana Weld Kifle, is the junior to the great scholar Memher Kifle Georgis. And so you have this chain of command of like uh, junior student and senior student, or master professor and top student, or A+ student, or 100% ranked, whatever, gifted, whatever word you want to use. And and that relationship, I think, allows for co-authorship that doesn't go the way of the dodo, right? The way of extinction, that many things go to committees. I wrote a kind of a spiritual blog post many moons ago that the number one instrument of the devil in church parishes are committees, because it's the number one way that people's times get sucked, and the kind of the vision of beauty and of God's will that you see in the liturgy and that you see in Scripture is simply not fulfilled. So, um, I see a bunch of people who are writing comments. I haven't read on Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic in History by Carlyle, so I'll put that off for another day. I gave you kind of a little bit of the auteur theory, and I did study the philosophy of art, but I'm no film critic. I've discussed certain things like that, and it's one of my favorite classes from my undergraduate days. But Andrew Saris is one of the first Americans, if not the first American, to kind of speak and definitely to write about the subject. I think it was certain French people why you have the word auteur instead of like author in the name of the theory. So there's a very short, it's three kind of images, but it's 4 pages called Andrew Saris Notes on the Auteur Theory in 1962. So what I'll do is we'll see if my voice doesn't run out, and I'll try reading that for you so you could see his kind of definition of this, which will help us see this in biblical translation, see this idea in broadcast journalism, see this idea in print journalism, see this idea in film, and to see this idea in history. So all these different fields of production. And I also mentioned collegiate basketball earlier. So like 6 different fields where this interplay between one individual who's a great and excellent person beyond competent and their vision going through versus the inherent kind of compromise and the lesser quality that you get from committee decisions. So I'm gonna read notes on the auteur theory in 1962 by Andrew Saris, and then I'll go back to your questions, and we'll see how long we stay on. As far as I know, there is no definition of the auteur theory in the English language that is by any American or British critic. Truffaut has recently gone to great pains to emphasize that the auteur theory was merely a polemical weapon for a given time and a given place, and I am willing to take him at his word. But lest I be accused of misappropriating a theory no one wants anymore, I will give the Cahir's critics full credit for the original formulation of an idea that reshaped my thinking on the cinema. First of all, how does the auteur theory differ from a straightforward theory of directors? Ian Cameron's article Films, Directors, and Critics in Movie of September 1962 makes an interesting comment on this issue. The assumption that underlies all the writing in movie is that the director is the author of a film, the person who gives it any distinctive quality. There are quite large exceptions with which I shall deal later. So far, so good, at least for the auteur theory, which even allows for exceptions. However, Cameron continues, on the whole, we accept the cinema of directors, although without going to the farthest out extremes of the la politique des auteurs, which makes it difficult to think of a bad director making a good film, and almost impossible to think of a good director making a bad one. We are back to Bazin again, although Cameron naturally uses different examples. That 3 otherwise divergent critics like Bazin, Rude, and Cameron make essentially the same point about the auteur theory suggests a common fear of its abuses. I believe, sounds like they're talking about monarchy. I believe there is a misunderstanding here about the auteur theory actually claims, particularly since the theory itself is so vague at the present time. First of all, the auteur theory, at least as I understand it and now intend to express it, claims neither the gift of prophecy nor the option of extra cinematic perception. Directors, even auteurs, do not always run true to form, and the critic can never assume that a bad director will always make a bad film. No, not always, but almost always, and that is the point. What is a bad director but a director who has made many bad films? Yeah, that's pretty tautological. What is the problem then? Simply this: the badness of a director is not necessarily considered the badness of a film. If Joseph Pevney directed Garbo, Cherkasov, Olivier, Belmondo, and Harriet Anderson in The Cherry Orchard, the resulting spectacle might not be entirely devoid of merit, with so many subsidiary auteurs to cover up for Joe. In fact, with this cast and this literary property, a Lumet might be safer than a Wells. The realities of casting apply to directors as well as to actors, but the auteur theory would demand the gamble with Wells if he were willing. Oh, that's that great if he were willing, if he has the will, the vitality. Marlon Brando has shown us that a film can be made without a director. Indeed, One Eyed Jacks is more entertaining than many films with directors. A director conscious critic would find it difficult to say anything good or bad about direction that is non existent. One can talk about photography, editing, acting, but not direction. The film even has personality, but The Longest Day and Mutiny on the Bounty, it is a cipher directorially. Obviously, the auteur theory cannot possibly cover every vagrant charm of the cinema. Nevertheless, the first premise of the auteur theory is the technical competence of a director as a criterion of value. A badly directed or an undirected film has no importance in a critical scale of values. But one can make interesting conversation about the subject, the script, the acting, the color, the photography, the editing, the music, the costumes, the decor, and so forth. That is the nature of the medium. You always get more for your money than mere art. Now, by the auteur theory, if a director has no technical competence, no elementary flair for the cinema, he is automatically cast out from the pantheon of directors. A great director has to be at least a good director. This is true in any art. What constitutes directorial talent is more difficult to define abstractly. There is less disagreement, however, on this first level of the auteur theory than there will be later. The second premise of the auteur theory is the distinguishable personality of the director as a criterion of value. Over a group of films, a director must exhibit certain recurrent characteristics of style which serve as his signature. For me, Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino come to mind quickly, but this is an aside. And probably Tim Burton as well, Wes Anderson. These all people have distinctive styles. That's not in the text. The way a film looks and moves should have some relationship to the way a director thinks and feels. This is an area where American directors are generally superior to foreign directors because so much of the American cinema is commissioned. A director is forced to express his personality through the visual treatment of material rather than through the literary content of the material. So this is why I directed, I'm forgetting his name, the Italian director who did The Young Pope and then later The New Pope. A Kukor who works with all sorts of projects has a more developed abstract style than a Bergman, who is free to develop his own scripts. Not that Bergman lacks personality, but his work has declined with the depletion of his ideas, largely because his technique never equaled his sensibility. Joseph L. Mankiewicz and Billy Wilder are other examples of writer-directors without adequate technical mastery. By contrast, Douglas Sirk and Otto Preminger have moved up the scale because their miscellaneous projects reveal a stylistic consistency. The Wes Andersons, the Quentin Tarantinos, the Robert Rodriguez's, the Tim Burtons that I mentioned earlier. Maybe the John Miliuses you could add to that list from my last broadcast. And John Carpenter I like as well. The third and ultimate premise of the auteur theory is concerned with interior meaning, the ultimate glory of the cinema as an art. Interior meaning is extrapolated from the tension between a director's personality and his material. This conception of interior meaning comes close to what Ostrouk defines as mise en scène, but not quite. It is not quite the vision of the world a director projects, nor quite his attitude toward life. It is ambiguous in any literary sense because part of it is embedded in the stuff of the cinema and cannot be rendered in non-cinematic terms. I like that. A little bit of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. Not quite as strong as the Euclid formula of the whole being greater than the part, but still strong. Truffaut, there's some synergy there. Truffaut has called it the temperature of the director on the set. That is a close approximation of its professional aspect. Dare I come out and say what I think it to be is an elan of the soul? Lest I seem unduly mystical, let me hasten to add that all I mean by soul is that intangible difference between one personality and another, all other things being equal. Sometimes this difference is expressed by no more than a beat's hesitation in the rhythm of a film. In one sequence of La Règle de Jeu, Renoir gallops up the stairs, turns to his right with a lurching movement, stops in hop-like uncertainty when his name is called by a coquettish maid, and then with marvelous post-reflex continuity resumes his bearishly shambling journey to the heroine's boudoir. If I could describe the musical grace note of that momentary suspension, and I can't, I might be able to provide a more precise definition of the auteur theory. As it is, all I can do is point at the specific beauties of interior meaning on the screen and later catalog the moments of recognition. The three premises of the auteur theory may be visualized as three concentric circles: the outer circle as technique, the middle circle, personal style, and the inner circle, interior meaning. The corresponding roles of the director may be designated as those of a technician, a stylist, and an auteur. There is no prescribed course by which a director passes through the three circles. Goddard once remarked that Visconti had evolved from a metteur en scène to an auteur, whereas Rossellini had evolved from an auteur to a metteur en scène. From opposite directions, they emerged with comparable status. Minelli began and remained in the second circle as a stylist. Buñuel was an auteur even before he had assembled the technique of the first circle. Technique is simply the ability to put a film together with some clarity and coherence. Nowadays, it is possible to become a director without knowing too much about the technical side, even the crucial functions of photography and editing. An expert production crew could probably cover up for a chimpanzee in the director's chair. How do you tell the genuine director from the quasi chimpanzee? After a given number of films, a pattern is established. In fact, the auteur theory itself is a pattern theory in constant flux. I would never endorse a Ptolemaic constellation of directors in a fixed orbit. At the moment, my list of auteurs runs something like this through the first 20. Remember, this is in the 60s. Ophuls, Renoir, Mizoguchi, Hitchcock, Chaplin, Ford, Wells, Dreyer, Rossellini, Murnau, Griffith, Sternberg, Einstein, von Stroheim, Buñuel, Bresson, Hawks, Lang, Flaherty, Vigo. This list is somewhat weighted toward seniority and established reputations. In time, some of these auteurs will rise, some will fall, and some will be displaced either by new directors or rediscovered ancients. Again, the exact order is less important than the specific definitions of these and as many as 200 other potential auteurs. I would hardly expect any other critic in the world fully to endorse this list, especially on faith. Only after thousands of films have been reevaluated will any personal pantheon have a reasonably objective validity. The task of validating the auteur theory is an enormous one, and the end will never be in sight. Meanwhile, the auteur habit of collecting random films in directorial bundles will serve posterity with at least a tentative classification. Although the auteur theory emphasizes the body of a director's work rather than isolated masterpieces, it is expected of great directors that they make great films every so often. The only possible exception to this rule I can think of is Abel Gance, whose greatness is largely a function of his aspiration. Even with Gance, LaRue is as close to being a great film as any single work of Flaherty's. Not that single works matter that much. As Renoir has observed, a director spends his life on variations of the same film. I love that. Two recent films, Boccaccio 70 and The Seven Capital Sins, unwittingly reinforced the auteur theory by confirming the relative standing of the many directors involved. If I had not seen either film, I would have anticipated that the order of merit in Boccaccio or Boccaccio 70 would be Visconti, Fellini, and De Sica, and in The Seven Capital Sins, Goddard, Chabrol, Demi, Vadim, De Broca, Molinaro. Dome Inosco's stage director and an unknown quantity in advance turned out to be the worst of the lot. There might be some argument about the relative badness of De Broca and Molinaro, but otherwise the directors ran true to form by almost any objective criterion of value. However, the main point here is that even in these frothy, ultra-commercial servings of entertainment, the contribution of each director had less in common stylistically with the work of other directors on the project than with his own previous work. Sometimes a great deal of corn must be husked to yield a few kernels of internal meaning. I recently saw Every Night at 8, one of the many maddeningly routine films Raoul Walsh has directed in his long career. This 1935 effort featured George Raft, Alice Faye, Francis Langford, and Patsy Kelly in one of those familiar plots about radio shows of the period. The film keeps moving along in the pleasantly unpretentious manner one would expect of Walsh, until one incongruously incongruously intense scene with George Raft thrashing about in his sleep, revealing his inner fears and mumbling dream talk. The girl he loves comes into the room in the midst of his unconscious avowals of feeling and listens sympathetically. This unusual scene was later amplified in High Sierra with Humphrey Bogart and Ida Lupino. The point is that one of the screen's most virile directors employed an essentially feminine narrative device to dramatize the emotional vulnerability of his heroes. If I had not been aware of Walsh and Every Night at 8, the crucial link to High Sierra would have passed unnoticed. Such are the joys of the auteur theory. So that is the end there of Andrew Saris' notes on the auteur theory in 1962. I see a ton of comments, so I'm gonna have to go up and see what you all are saying, and I'll just respond to you. I'll try to stay on for a little bit more. We're about 40 minutes deep. We'll see if I could bang another 20 minutes out with you all. So the last thing I saw was Mufak Adasalase. Let's go to Nemo. Who has a better translation of the Gospel of Thomas, Leighton or Blatz? I've never read the Gospel of Thomas, although I've read that excerpts of it are in the Miracles of Mary, which I have heard and read. So maybe I've come across it without recognizing it. J. Rod McScary. Can you recommend a current English translation of the Orthodox Tawahado Biblical Canon? There is no current English translation of the Orthodox Tawahado Biblical Canon. If you want the closest thing to a New Testament that would be acceptable to our canon is this early Greek source, which is translated into English, and hopefully gonna release the audiobook for one day. It's called the Eastern Orthodox Bible, or it's called the Greek Orthodox Bible. It was a project started by the editor, Father Laurent Kleinwerk, from 2007 to 2011. People basically abandoned the project, so the New Testament is still there. Some of the books they make for the liturgy, I have the iPhone app. I had the print version. I gave it away to my beloved cousin. So it's a great translation. It's just the New Testament online. If you still find their old website, the last time I checked, it was down. You might find like Zephaniah or some random parts of the Old Testament, but it was like a group work that never ended up finished. But Father Laurent Kleinwerk was in charge, and I should be able to take care. I've done, I think, 2 of the Gospels in audiobook form. So I really need to push that project along. Been behind a lot of stuff. If I get to it, I'll release an audio version of that, and that's what I'll recommend to people. In the meantime, you could get the app, or you could purchase from Amazon, Greek Orthodox Bible or Eastern Orthodox Bible, Father Laurent Kleinwerk. For the Old Testament, I mentioned earlier the Lexham English Septuagint from Logos. Even though they're Protestants, I think it's a great translation from the Greek Septuagint. So that way you get your double Greek. If you think the Hebrew is important, go to Robert Alter's Hebrew Bible, like I told you. But the truth of it is there's really nothing out there. I like the Lexham English Septuagint. It has the book of Enoch. I don't think it's entirety, but it has 80 chapters, I think, of the book of Enoch. I don't think it has Jubilees, so you'd have to get Jubilees separately. The 4 books of Maccabees, I've only seen Rastas who've translated that before, and I think they translated it from the Amharic to the English, not from Ge'ez. Um, Most of the deuterocanonical books, which we would just call canonical books in our tradition, uh, but sometimes also deuterocanonical or second canonical, would be found in the Lexham English Septuagint as well. iGalaxis. For an English Bible translation, there's the Eastern Orthodox Bible translation of the New Testament. Yes, that's the one that I was mentioning from Father Laurent Kleinwerk. It's the official ecclesiastical text published in 1904 by Constantinople. Yeah, and that's great for us too. There's a saying by the biblical interpretation school, the Oxumite biblical interpretation school, which is heavily connected to the school of Antioch, more so than Alexandria, which would surprise people that thought our Coptic overlords were just running the show the whole time. They say, "Fidelik atil watirgwame Yahewa." Fidelik atil watirgwame Yahewa, which is related to the Pauline phrase that the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. But here, the word spirit is replaced by interpretation. And so the Ethiopian fathers, if you watch the episode I did with Diakon Alamasalasi most recently, we talk about this. They knew they often had a faulty text. And so, it is often the work of a king. I think I could think of two kind of big moments where kings kind of demanded certain consolidations and of biblical texts, but really Ethiopia was kind of a mess in the sense it was like ancient days up until very recently, even in the 20th century, where people just had random scrolls lying around. You may have the scroll of Ezekiel, you may have the scroll of Isaiah. In fact, a huge part of the 20th century is like searching for the Ethiopic or the Ge'ez interpretation of the scroll of Ezekiel. The scholar Kidana Wel Kifle and Memher Kifle Georgis, who I mentioned earlier, that's the big thing that they contributed to the church is they were able to get their hands on some interpretations of the scroll of Ezekiel, and they preserved it so that the church has it today. But a lot of the books were separate, and there were not a lot of commercial Bibles. The first people to have commercial Bibles in Ethiopia were like the Catholics and the Lutherans. In fact, my paternal grandfather was a deacon of Ashwa Mikael, which is a St. Michael's parish in Diredawa, Ethiopia. And he wanted in his teenage years, I think he was 19 or something, which would have been sometime, I don't know, 1920 or 1925, maybe 1927, somewhere around there. He was a pretty old guy. He wanted an Amharic Bible, and the Ethiopian church at the time didn't have one, and they wouldn't have one for another score years, for another like 20 years or so. So he had this Bible that he got from the Lutherans, and I still have it. So it's like a 100-year-old Bible that the Lutherans translated into Amharic. But it just shows you the Tawahado Church did not have a commercial Bible at the time. Otherwise, he would have gotten it. So I'm sorry we don't really have that. J. Rod, does the EOB include the entire Tawahado canon? No, it's just the New Testament, and it has not in the commercially available version, but if you could find their old website, they used to have like samples of the Old Testament on there. X Galaxies, no, it's not Oriental Orthodox. I just wanted to bring EOB into the light a bit. Wasn't necessarily replying to your comment. Apologies, no worries. Alam, unrelated question. What are your top favorite novels? Oh my god, I'm so bad at this. Top favorite novels. Man. Mm, I'm gonna be in trouble, man. Um, uh, I loved growing up. Uh, these three authors. Let me give you some authors. It's easier to give you authors than book titles and series. Let me get the one that you're gonna hate out of the way, which is Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. You can say whatever issues there are with it, but I think the big picture truth there and her ability to read people is continually prescient, and her impact and the magnitude of her impact is I think undeniable. And at the very least you got to appreciate her anti-communism coming out of the Soviet Union. um, I don't subscribe to her view of selfishness. I think what she was actually saying was self-interested, and I think it gets you out of the weird arguments. I don't like her views on intellectual property. I'm obviously not atheist. I'm an ordained member of the Ethiopian Church. So there are a lot of things I don't care for about Ayn Rand, but Atlas Shrugged was great. In terms of like the real big authors, novel wise, Orson Scott Card, and particularly the Ender's Game book and Ender's Shadow, Ender's Game from Ender's perspective, Ender's Shadow from Bean's perspective, who is kind of the disciple of Ender and Ender's Game. Those game things are super cool. And check out Synthesis School, by the way, if any of you have kids. It's a very interesting new online school. Uh, a couple degrees distant, or you could say 1 degree distant from Elon Musk. Elon Musk is not running the show, but he gave some initial startup funds to the school that came before it, from which the Synthesis School launched. And the Synthesis School feels like the Ender's Game books when I was reading it. And the guy behind it, Chris, he's conscious of that, and he's conscious of like the values of jujitsu and of learning in nature as well. So it's a really cool project. So Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, Ender's Game and Ender's Shadow from Orson Scott Card. Um, uh, oh my God, what's the name? R.A. Salvatore. And I just love that he goes by R.A. R.A. Salvatore's. I began with the Dark Elf trilogy. So for me, it's that. And that character, Driss Duerden, was just put into he was put into video game as an unlockable character in Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance 2, which I took advantage of. But whenever I played games from this kind of Forgotten Realms world, like Baldur's Gate, like the Dark Alliance series, like Champions of Norath 1 and 2. I played so many of these RPG style games with my friends. I didn't have the board Dungeons and Dragons, so I had like the video game versions from PlayStation to like PlayStation 4 or whatever. And now PlayStation 5, but I don't have one. Uh, that series, the Dark Elf trilogy, I really loved it. The main premise of the Dark Elf trilogy, so Ender's Game is like space invasion, and then what happens, spoiler alert, after like xenocide or genocide. You could say xenocide, that's what he says, depending on what level of analysis you're saying. The Dark Elf trilogy, you have like the dark elves who have this aristocratic society that is matriarchal, and they have this matriarchal demon goddess, and they're seen as like evil versions of the elves. Okay, and they live underground in a place called Mensa Baranzan. And the particular main character, who's from an aristocratic house, is kind of a I don't remember if he's a bastard son or a low ranking son, and they try to force him to be a magician, but he wants to be more of a warrior. And that kind of trope of the person pushed into the magic class who's supposed to be, or the priestly caste who's supposed to be a warrior, I relate to it a lot. Dark elf, darker guy in America, you could relate to that. um I see that same trope in Dragon Ball Z, which was one of my favorite animes growing up, with Gohan. He comes from the Saiyan warrior race, but his mom Chi Chi wants to make him the scholar. And the tension between being a scholar and a warrior is a tension, have in my family. My dad's side is a lot of scholars. My mom's side is a lot of warriors, even though my mom herself is a scholar. So I think in the Ethiopian context, you see that in Dragon Ball Z with Gohan. You see that, and you see it in the Dark Elf trilogy and all of the R.A. Salvatore books. I probably read like 8 of Orson Scott Card's books. I've only read one of Ayn Rand's, although I've read other writings of hers that are not full-length books. I've read about 20 of R.A. Salvatore's books, and then I read about 20 more books of Raymond E. Feist. Magician Apprentice is the first in that series. So Magician Apprentice is really cool. It has a bunch of guilds, and people choose this apprentice relationship. You see that a lot, this idea of a mentor, senior, junior, master, professor, student. I like that kind of old school way of instruction, the classical way or the ancient way. And so instead of being a knight or a blacksmith, this guy finds that he's not fitting in anywhere, and he goes to the magician. So Magician's Apprentice by Raymond D. Feist, and there's like 20 plus books in that series. I'm behind in R.A. Salvatore and in um, Raymond D. Feist. I think I've read all the Orson Scott Card. I might be missing one or two of Orson Scott Card. With Raymond D. Feist and R.A. Salvatore, I'm probably behind 5 to 6 books, but I've read like 20 in that series, and those people are so prolific. Finally, it's a cheat code because I watched the movies first, but I'll just say J.R.R. Tolkien, and it's a cop out. I did read The Hobbit, and I still have never watched the Hobbit films. So, we'll start off with The Hobbit and say J.R.R. Tolkien. And it's also cool that people like Father Andrew Damick has this like podcast connecting Orthodox Christianity and Lord of the Rings. And I'm a fan of that podcast as well. Let me go back to your questions. Ivan Spaziano, hi, good morning. Good morning, ¿cómo estai, Signore Spaziano? Grazie a Dio. Nemo, yep, Wes Anderson and his use of pastel colors and hipster soundtracks come to mind. J-Rod, no worries. I have heard good things about the EOB. Back to iGalaxis. Galaxis. Good to know it's only recently popped up on my radar, so I'm still trying to make up what the consensus is about. Spaziano, your Italian is very nice. That's are all very famous cinematic works. Fellini, more than any other, was like our Bergman. I am not great at Italiano. I know basic readings. I have a lot of Italian cousins, mixed, obviously. I'm not Italian. And I speak Spanish, un poco español. Sometimes that actually messes me up when I try to speak Italian, but who knows? Maybe I'll read I'll learn Italian one day to go read the fascist Cerulli and some of the other people. He has this huge book called, I think, La Historia on Ethiopian history. And there are other people in the field too, Italians, Portuguese, and Germans. So I think I got to learn. I know a little bit of Portuguese as well, a little obrigado, a little beleza, just from hanging out with the Brazilians I do jujitsu with. But, I really only speak Spanish like that. So maybe I'll learn Italian and Portuguese and German one day to go read what the Western scholarship has to say about Ethiopia. And there's one French book on Conduciarid, one of his books. I'm forgetting which one, but one of his main books. It might be the Zimmari Wamoasid. No, no, no. It's the Mi'raf. It's on the Mi'raf. Now I remember, which is one of the shorter books alongside Soma Dugwa, which sometimes people include Soma Dugwa within the Dugwa, which are the antiphonary. Soma Dugwa and Mi'raf are two of the books of hymns in the Ethiopian church that people usually learn what's called Mata Timirt. They learn at night and they just learn through memorization. They usually don't look at the text itself, although it may be different now in 2021. Well, folks, anyone interested in the actual teachings of Rabbi Jesus of Nazareth was go read the Gospel of Thomas. Yeah, I don't know about that, man. The church does not accept the Gospel of Thomas, so neither do I. Thank you for your translation recommendations. Every young guy has had an Ayn Rand phase, it seems. Nemo. Okay. I don't know if these are quotations from the Gospel of Thomas. I'm not going to put that out there. Constantine, are you familiar with Richmond Lattimore's translation of the New Testament? He was a scholar of ancient Greek and is most famous for his translation of the Iliad and the Odyssey. I don't. It's great that you mentioned that. Father Paul always mentions the Iliad and the Odyssey in terms of length. I've read both of those in high school and in middle school, or maybe just high school. He always mentions them to say that the Older Testament or the Hebrew Bible is longer than both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that you should be impressed by that. I don't know Richmond Lattimore. If there's anything more you could say about him, I'm open to hearing about it. Alam says the Hobbit films don't do the book justice. Anyway, well, yeah, I haven't seen them. So that's that. I've reached all of your questions. I don't see any super chats. I don't see any stickers, and we're a few minutes away from about the hour mark, which is probably where I tap out. Are there any other last questions? We covered the auteur theory, or the idea of implicit and inherent biases within the structure of something coming from an individual versus a committee or a group or an organization or a blob or a conglomerate. And when you allow individuals to flourish, you get a certain amount of quality that you just wouldn't get otherwise. We talked about this in history with the great man theory, which comes from Carlyle. You have the auteur theory from the French, but then exposited by Andrew Sarris as well in the American tradition of film. I gave you Ben Howland in terms of collegiate basketball, who applied the man defense versus zone defense, and he did it in real teams instead of just subbing out individuals, but like having sets of teams, so he could really analyze the individuals, and it's not based off of exhaustion. I told you about a New York Times and the New Yorker versus all of the great people on Substack, and shout out to Substack. I've got one of my own, aksum.substack.com. I'm sure you probably know about it. I've been derelict in my duties over there too, but we've maintained the YouTube activity, and we'll get back to that. And it's also great to go back and read everything if you haven't read the past posts. And we talked about broadcast journalism, all of the Ethiopians, Eritreans, Djiboutians, and Somalians who are against CNN nowadays and repeating the Trump rhetoric, which is great. It's hilarious. Any bashing of the corporate media needs to be done. And it's exciting. It's exciting going forward. Constantine says Lattimore has one of the best translation of the Iliad, in my opinion. And while he was a more secular scholar, he did convert to Catholicism before he died. Very interesting. Yeah, if I come across the Lattimore translation, I'd love to compare it. I always go to the Beatitudes in Matthew 5 or other kind of passages that I know to see exactly how do they render them. In general, the kind of greater Sermon on the Mount from Matthew 4 to Matthew 7, I know those passages pretty well. So
those are the places where I like to examine different biblical translations from. But for me, ultimately, other people have said this, and I'll repeat it because repetition is a great Semitic tool of emphasis. Read the version of the Bible that's going to get you to read the Bible more. That's it. That's it. I saw an NIV, and I don't really care for the NIV, where they took out all the chapters and verses. And it was some Reformed Calvinist guy that was posting about it. I liked it. I thought it was beautiful. I'm not a big fan of the NIV. I think there are too many Protestant politics going on there. But the idea that there are no chapters and verses and that you just flow through the text and that you're more likely to get the bigger picture of scripture, I love that. If you understand one area of scripture really well, you read it, you reread it like 20, 30 times, the other parts of scripture will start to make more sense. So I encourage you to do that. Ivan Spaziano, that's why you pronounce is good. It's because of the Spanish that you already know. I've studied the Bible years ago. I've needed to learn ancient Greek, Hebrew, Latin, and English, of course. Yeah, all all great languages. Father Paul Nadim Tarazi talks about get the Vulgate, get the Masoretic text, get the Septuagint, um, and then oh my God, who is the great? There's a great Ugarit scholar that he always mentions. Let's see if I could find him. uh, Ugarit scholar Psalm. He did a commentary on the Psalms. Mitchell Dahoud. So he always recommends Mitchell Dahoud, who's this Ugarit scholar. It's another Semitic language. So he says, get your Ugarit, get your Masoretic Hebrew, get your Septuagint or your Old Greek, for short, the OG, get your English, whatever. Compare them all and try to see what the original would be through comparative analysis. And you'll spend the rest of your time. Thanks for sharing the Ethiopian biblical canon of books. Yeah, we have 4 different Maccabees, totally unique. We have Jubilees, we have Enoch, and then the rest will be the same with the Greeks and the Catholics in terms of deuterocanonical. Sometimes people stick in Didascalia and Shepherd of Hermas, which are all these works which you could find from Logos Bible software on the Apostolic Fathers. Sometimes they stick that in the New Testament as well. Another book called Synodos. So those are the kind of things that they do. Last question: what Ethiopian patristic text would you like to see translated to English? There's no question for me. You have to start off with Qaddus Yared. So first, it has to be Qaddus Yared and his books. The Dugwa is his main book. Some people count Soma Dugwa as a part of the Dugwa. Mi'raf is the book I told you. I think someone translated a lot of parts into it into French. So if any of you speak French out there, maybe you could understand that and tell us what it all says. Then you have the Zimmari and the Mawasa'it. Zimmari are hymns for communion. Mawasa'it are hymns for the dead or for funerary services. So those are the 4 books or 5 books, depending on how you count it, of Saint Jared of Aksum or Qaddus Yared. And that has to be first. After that, people could go to Abba Georgis of Gasicha or of Sagala and his books on the Sa'atat, which are the orologium or the prayer of hours, the liturgy of the hours. It's also called in the Western tradition. So that's a huge thing that needs to be translated. Some people have done parts of that, but nobody has done the full thing yet. And I know some people who are working on that. I'm working on actually a different set of that that's not by Abba Georgis. Um, very close to the end of at least the publishing. We'll publish, my co author and I will publish the Ge'ez first, and then we'll work on an English translation. We already actually have some pages of the English done, but we're way behind in terms of the English, but we're very close to finishing just the Ge'ez part of that manuscript of an ancient liturgy of the hours. So here's your sneak peek to that. And then finally, we just got out of Zamanetz Ege or Warhatz Ege, which is the era of the flower or the flower song. And that is composed by Abbas Ege Dingil. So Abbas Ege Dingil's work needs to be translated as well. Uh, I'm going to keep going. You said 1, but I'm just going to keep going. There is Abba Bahari, who's done Mazmura Christos. I think it's been translated by high publishers into Amharic. I don't think it's been translated into English. So Mazmura Christos by Abba Bahari. He's also the guy who wrote Zenahu Lagalla, which is the very first historic account in Ge'ez of the Oromo expansion into the Ethiopian Empire. So he's got that work, and then Mazmura Christos, which is kind of sociological, but also like historical, and it's also hymns as well. The Mazmura Christos, or the hymns of Christ. And then you have the entire Andimta tradition. My friend Deacon Adam will come back once his book is published, but you'll see in his book, there are about, I think, 4 books of the Aksumite School of Biblical Interpretation, which have been translated into English. I believe it's Revelation, Micah, Genesis, and the Psalms. The Psalms is not all the Psalms. It's this nun from the Netherlands who used to live in Israel. I think her name's Sister Helen or something. She did like 12 of the Psalms. Like there are 150 Psalms, or 151. So uh, there's a lot of work to be done. And there's all the other books of the Bible which have interpretations in our school. All of those need to be translated into English. So if you want to make your way in the field and you're a prolific person, learn Ge'ez and start translating this stuff into English. There's a lot of work to be done. Mitch, Carlyle's lectures on heroes are great. I was reading Past and Present today. He wrote on the hero as poet and hero as prophet. Maybe he forgot hero as translator. Yes, the translator or the interpreter is a hero. That's at least my form of heroism that I'm trying to do. I'm just in the very beginning of my translation interpretation career. I've been doing it for like 9, 10 years in terms of verbal translation predominantly, but then a few documents like housing documents and healthcare documents and stuff like that. Um, I did the code of ethics and the standards of practice for the International Ombudsman Association when I used to be an ombudsman. There's a nice Scandinavian word for you, Adam, Zahawi. So I've done things, but books, I'm just getting started. My grandfather has 3 books that I plan to translate into English. One on Menelik, Emperor Menelik II, one on Emperor Theodore, and then a memoir of when one of the communist rulers tried to execute him in Debre Marcos, and that didn't work. So I've got about, I think, 8 pages of that or something on my Substack. That's up there for people to read as a sample. But I'm working on this Liturgy of the Hours first, and the audiobooks too. Too many projects. I'm a little scatterbrained, so pray for me to have focus. Renee Groot, I have downloaded some books from Carlisle because of Moldbug. Just skimming through it, he seems hard to read. He has a weird style I'm not really used to. Yeah, it's English from the 1800s, so it's going to be a little harder. But hey, you found it for free. I'm sure you didn't pay for it, so do your best and forget the rest. And if you need the mediation of another person, no problem. It's not meant for everybody. That's Mitch. That's definitely normal. Carlisle's an intense read. I love it though. Yeah, I do too. David Bentley Hart is a little socialist when he writes, and I don't care for his socialism. But no matter what he writes, even when he writes about politics or some theology that I don't like, his writing is just beautiful. He's one of the few people who sends me to the dictionary very often, and my English is not too shabby. So I appreciate that. It reminds me, it humbles me. It's like the anti-library, the concept of Nassim Taleb, that you have books in your library, not that are trophies that you've read, but that you haven't read to remind you of how much you still don't know. Absolute last question. Where's the best place to learn is as a native? Oh, you know the answer to that? The Abednet schools. Go back home. Aba Adday. Aba Adday. Sadly, the best schools are not in Eritrea, but I'm sure you could find some good schools in Eritrea if you go to Dabra Bazain or Dabra Sina, one of the big monasteries in Ertra. But hey, there's a great tradition that even through the beef of the wars never stopped. As one example, there's a Marigita down in San Diego, Eritrean Marigita. Even the word Marigita is Amharic, and they go by that. Sometimes you use the Tigrinya accent, say Marijeta, who I think spent 17 years learning in Gwender. So go to Gwender and learn there as well. If you knew Amharic, Getachew Haile has a book called Gi'ez Bakallalu. Search for Leslau and Dillman and the works that they've done for grammars. Write Ethiopic grammar in Google and PDF and search for that. Dillman or Leslau or one of those people. should have some classic Ethiopic grammar. I'm sure it's available online for free if you search for something like that as well. But yeah, there's nothing that's going to help you more than learning from a traditional source. If you can get to Hamburg, Germany, Abba Harui, who wrote the book on Qini in English, published by Gorgias Press, he's a Qini mamhir. He's a Qini professor or a Guz poetry professor, and he's in Germany, so he's kind of close to you out there in Europe. If you can get there, maybe you could learn from him one on one. Ivan Spaziano, an app just in English dedicated to those journey Ethiopian prayers will be something like a dream historically in spirituality. I talked to an Eritrean deacon brother in the Bay Area. He actually wanted me to do the audio version. I just didn't have time. Maybe I'll have to go reach back out to him. He said he was working on something like that, an English version, and he wanted me to do the audio. It must be released by now because he talked to me like 6 months ago. So check the App Store. Check Ethiopic. If you don't know how to spell Ethiopic, check Ethiopic and check Guz in the App Store, in Android especially, but also Apple. And you may find English prayers that are available there. Let me come back and get you one book. I'll promote one book by Deacon Tasfa Mikhail, who's on my program. So this is not my book. This is by Diakon Rowan Williams, not to be confused with the guy in the Church of England called that. I think he's a bishop. Daily Prayers of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. So this is from the Sion Mariam Parish that is in London in the UK. You could find their YouTube channel. I've taught at their church virtually during this Pan Dulce or this Panaderia. But the Daily Prayers of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the pocket edition, I have the print here by Archdeacon Tasfa Mikhail or Rowan Williams. It was first published in April 2019, and the revised edition came out in February and May of 2020. So right in the middle of the Pan Dulce. It has both the Patriarch Abba Mercurios, number 4, and number 6, Abba Matias on the inside. I like that. And it has the common prayer, which are the daily prayers, the veneration of Mary, which is the praise of Mary, the Wuddasi Mariam. It has Ankas Abraham, which is the gate of light. The angels venerate her, which is Yewed Disuwa Malaikt. If you look on artandscience.gumroad.com, I sell my own translation of Yewed Disuwa Malaikt, which I'm pretty sure Diakon Tasfa Mikhail looked at when he did his revised edition. Him and I have looked at each other's stuffs, and he's been on my podcast before as well. He's the British former DJ, former Rasta, who learned for many years in Ethiopia, learned Guz in Ethiopia, has a wonderful Ethiopian wife and Ethiopian children, and is a great servant of the church in the UK. He also has here Melka Mariam and Melka Jesus, which is the image or the likeness. Malik is chose not to translate, and he explains all that in here. But again, the daily prayers of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. Go find like their Facebook, their website, their everything. I'm not going to find it for you right now, but it's Zion or Zion Mariam Church in the UK, and they have a lot of English services on their YouTube channel as well. Oh, salam lakum Moreno. Oh, no way. He's on here. Diakon Tasfa Mikhail. I'm promoting your book and you're in the chat. Amazing. Renee Groot. I will start with Diakon Tasfa Mikhail, you could send them a link to buy your book. I'm promoting your book. So put your link in there and they can get the book for you. We'll get you some more book sales here. He's done great work, and in the episode that we talk about other translation work that he's working on. He's also a prolific translator, so one of the heroes of translation in the Ethiopian church is in the live chat. Lasad Corday, hope all is well. I got to go, but we'll leave like. Okay, todo bien, patron. Nos vemos. Ivan Spaziano, I will find out. God bless. Amen. Ciao, everyone. Peace be with you.